Rabbi Benjamin Sharff that's here from Temple, Israel to teach our Beit Midrash today. I think we all know Rabbi, but he has been here in Omaha as head rabbi since the summer of 2023 here in Omaha, and we are excited to learn with him today on the topic of Moses Maimonides, an exploration of one of the greatest thinkers and teachers to ever come out of the Jewish tradition. So thank you for being here, Rabbi.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be here with you guys. A few things to mention. I think I've met or know just about everyone in this room. But if not, I'm Rabbi Sharff, Senior Rabbi at Temple, Israel, and it's just a delight and pleasure to be with you. So Rabbi Berzin was originally scheduled at this time, but she's actually currently leading an immigration social justice trip in Arizona with a number of our members, so she asked me if I could cover, which I was more than happy to do. I was only just a little bit nervous because the last time I taught in Beit Midrash last year at this time, we had a blizzard, and the only people who were able to make it were pretty much from Federation and the JCC. And so I said, no way am I doing it again in February. I will teach in April. Best laid plans, but don't worry, the blizzard's coming tomorrow. And then just a couple of caveats with relationship to that is the presentation I'm making today is part of a larger course that I will teach again on Moses Maimonides. I've not had nearly as much time to prepare as I normally would, given the quick turnover of it. So I do apologize if it's not quite as expansive or as extensive as I am hoping, but hopefully you'll find it informational. Basically, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about Maimonides, talk a little bit about Spain, talk a little bit about what the world was like during his time. All of you should have grabbed a packet. We're not going to get to everything in the packet, no matter how hard I try. I always over-prepare. Just to give you a little sight into my own neurosis, people ask me what I'm afraid of, and the one thing I'm afraid of is running out of material. So we're not going to get to everything today, but these packets are yours. Feel free to keep them and refer to them. Also, I brought a sample of some of the books that I have referenced and will reference. The main one is a book, Maimonides by Joel Kramer, The Life and World of One of the Civilization's Greatest Minds. You can find this on Amazon, at your local bookstore and things like that, and you can certainly reference it. And then a few others. Probably one of the preeminent books on the history of Christian anti-Semitism, Constantine's Sword by James Carroll. Whenever I teach a subject adjacent, this is one of my main reference materials. And by the way, I don't get anything from these guys. It's just, this is an excellent resource. I encourage everyone to have it in their library. We have the history of the Jews of Spain, of the Sephardic experience, which if ever you're thinking about making a trip to Spain, this is a great resource. And then last but not least, a translation of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. I will reference this book if we get to it. And by the way, just a couple of other caveats as we dive in. I do welcome all questions. I promise to answer half of your questions, and of those I promise to answer half of them correctly. So may the odds ever be in your favor. What I may say, though, is I do ask people to raise hands just so I can call on you. I may do this just so I can finish my thought, because I find as I do this more and more often, my thoughts are more and more easily derailed. So, but I know none of you can relate to that experience. So, Maimonides. Moses Maimonides, also known as Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, or as we oftentimes refer to him as the Rambam, was born in Cordova, Spain. When was he born? We're not entirely sure. According to different histories, there are possible two dates that he was born on. The first was March 30th of 1135, which is based off what is one of his grandsons, David ben Abraham, wrote. According to his grandson, Maimonides was born on the eve of Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, which means he was probably not born on that day, because if we're not sure about someone's birthday, we oftentimes ascribe it to a major event, either historical or according to the calendar. One of my favorite, and this is completely unrelated, examples of this, of MGM, of Mayer, who was born in Russia. He declared, who helped found MGM, he declared his birthday was the 4th of July. So just an example. And according to other commentaries, Maimonides can trace his lineage all the way back to Rabbi Judah Hanassi, as well as King David, which is lovely, but probably not entirely correct. According to Joel Kramer in his book on Maimonides, he was most likely born either in 1137 or 1138. So for those carding him, you got to check the dates on his driver's license. Now, we don't actually know much about Maimonides' lineage. We know his father was Rabbi Maimon ben Joseph, but we don't have any of his writings, be them commentaries, legal responsa, or treatises to our knowledge. Though we do have a sense that his father, Rabbi Maimon ben Joseph, was born to a fairly prominent family. And the name Maimon is a fairly common among Arabic names, both among Muslims and Maghribi Jews. The term Maghreb is generally applied to Jews of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. But an older Arabic usage pertained only to the area of the three countries between the ranges of the Atlas Mountains and the Mediterranean Sea. So when you see a name like Maimon, it's a fairly small regional name that was used especially among the Jews at that time. And historically speaking, that would include some people from Spain, Portugal, Sicily, and Malta, especially during the periods of Arab and Muslim control of the region. Also, no great surprise, we know almost nothing about Rambam's mother. Some biographies have speculated that she died during childbirth, but truth is, women, no great surprise, were very rarely mentioned in medieval literature. So we just really don't know anything about her. But what we do know is that Maimonides, Rambam, died in Egypt on December 13th, 1204. And we know he is considered one of the greatest Torah scholars of all time. He was a rabbi, a physician, a philosopher. He lived in Spain, Morocco, a little bit in Israel, and then in Egypt in the Middle Ages. And he was one of the preeminent medieval Jewish philosophers whose ideas influenced both the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world. Questions so far? Okay, so I'm going to take a step away from my note and just sort of emphasize a few pieces about Moses Maimonides. According to some understanding, there are some who attribute that he was the last person to know everything about everything. Obviously, he's never been to a congregational board meeting. But he was one of those people who lived at a time where it was possible to know a lot about a lot of subjects. So he was very much influenced during his time in Spain, and then later on where he grew up in Morocco, and then ultimately settling in Egypt. And he's important because he represents a bridge between the rabbinic world and the non-Jewish world. And I mention that because at that time, what happened is we talk about the Dark Ages with the fall of the Roman Empire and all of the knowledge of the Greco-Roman world being lost. What happened is it was actually rediscovered in part by the Arabic world. They rediscovered philosophy, algebra. To middle school students, you're welcome. And then what happened is the Jews who lived between the Christian world and the Arab world sort of served as translators and interpreters. So, and I think we don't necessarily get enough credit for this, is that we basically help shepherd that knowledge along to the Christian world where it sort of was rediscovered, if you will, even though it was very much living a lot in the Arab world throughout those times. And so Maimonides not only was brilliant, but he was also living at a very important time of sort of a collision of the three cultures. And then the second thing I'm going to mention before we sort of dive more into the history and the culture and the region of it is we don't have, like many people, like Rashi, for example, we don't have a Maimonides commentary on the Torah, and we don't have a Maimonides commentary on the Talmud. But what we do have is his seminal work, which is the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is important because what he did is he read through the Talmud. And I assume everyone's read the Talmud, all 2 million words of it. The Talmud, just as a refresher, is basically rabbis arguing with each other over the Mishnah. And what is the Mishnah but the rabbis arguing with each other over the Torah? And what they're doing is they're really trying to take the Torah in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, and to make it livable, breathable, doable in a time where we no longer have the sacrificial cult. We no longer have the temple. If you think about it, of the 613 mitzvot in the Torah, about half of them are not applicable because you're not making sacrifices anymore once the temple was destroyed by the Romans in year 70 in the Common Era. So even before that, 200 years before that, there are these group of scholar scribes who are arguing with, okay, you're supposed to say the Shema in the morning and in the evening. What does that mean? And they start to talk about how you actually do that. You're supposed to write it on your forehead and on your heart. How do you do that? What do they come up with? Tefillin. When you say the Shema, when you get up and when you go to bed. That's why you don't say it in the Mincha service, by the way. And so they're the ones who are starting to make Judaism live and breathe outside of the temple cult. The problem is, for the most part, one says this and one says that, but they don't tell you what the answer is. Because the goal is not the answer, the goal is the argument. And so the Mishnah and Talmud are filled with lots and lots of arguments, but oftentimes very little in the way of legal opinions. So what Maimonides brilliantly does is he takes the Talmud and he creates a document, a book, really, which takes out the arguments and gives you the answers. With the idea being that most Jews don't have time to really dive into the arguments. Most of them have day jobs. And so they just want to know what they're supposed to do. And so he lays it out in a very logical fashion, and many of his colleagues hated it because he took out the argument. He took out Talmud study. Nonetheless, the Mishnah Torah became the basis for the Shulchan, for the Torah, and then the Shulchan Aruch, the legal codes that are the foundation for halakha. So even though it may not have been well received amongst his generation, it became the seminal work that has defined Jewish law ever since. So in that sense, and he did it in a way that was accessible, which also gives you insight into his brilliance, because a great teacher, what do? They take a complicated idea and make it understandable and present it in a way that you're curious about it to keep navigating it. So we felt that was enough for most people in order to understand Jewish law. Yeah.
So, but didn't most people, weren't they illiterate back then? So did he like for the rabbis to teach others?
So most Jews were not illiterate.
Oh, okay.
So you do study. You would study in Cheder. You would study the Bible. You'd study some Talmud. You would study. So they were not illiterate. They just were not necessarily focused on the intricacies of Jewish law because they had day jobs. Now, at the same time, Maimonides also was an incredibly curious person. He also had a connection to Jewish mysticism, and he felt that we also got to be asking the big questions, but the big questions are not for most people. For most people, it's enough to know what you're supposed to do. And so with that in mind, he also wrote a treatise called The Guide for the Perplexed. Now, if you think you're perplexed, wait until you read the guide. But really, it's a treatise and an exploration of the greater theological questions, intellectuals, some rabbis, and basically he writes it as a series of letters between a curious student and himself. So he was really navigating two worlds, the practical and then also the philosophical. And he presented both out into the larger world because he really wanted to find a way to make it more accessible for everyone, regardless of where they were. And Maimonides is also the one who came up with the ladder of tzedakah, the different ways that you were supposed to give. The first being the donor and the recipient know each other. And ultimately, the goal is for neither to know who is giving and who is receiving. The foundational principle, by the way, when it comes to tzedakah, and this is something that I point out often, which is in Judaism, you are supposed to love what you're doing. You're supposed to feel passionate about it, and you're supposed to feel uplifted and sacred and holy because of the things you do. That's why we say motzi, that's why we say birkat hamazon, to elevate the eating experience that we're supposed to make holy, and if we can make that holy, we can make everything else holy. But also recognize sometimes you're just not feeling it. And sometimes you give because that's, as Jews, what you're supposed to do. And you know what? That is the mitzvah. And that dayenu is good enough. But he wanted to explore it more to say, okay, if we want to elevate the process of engaging in tzedakah, which, by the way, tzedek means justice, in case, just as a quick refresher, meaning to realign the world the way it's supposed to be, that there are different levels to it to think about. If you're giving and you want to be acknowledged for it, dayenu, you've done the mitzvah. But let's explore how to make it potentially more holy. And so these are but a few examples of how he is navigating the world. And on top of it, he had a day job. He was a physician. So clearly he didn't have to spend all day filing for insurance paperwork. So, and physicians, as an aside, which you're going to hear me do a lot today, physicians, part of the reason, there were a few things Jews got involved with in the Middle Ages, somewhat in the Arab world and a lot in the Christian world, simply because we were not afforded many opportunities. We couldn't join guilds. We couldn't own land. We couldn't, they got very nervous about us having positions of prominence. Why did we get involved in money lending and international banking? Because the Christians forbade Christians from doing that, but they allowed Jews to do it. And what would happen is a local royal would become so indebted to a Jewish banker that ultimately they would create a blood libel, give them an excuse to kill the Jewish banker, thus the debts were wiped out. So it was never really a good thing, never really worked out well for us. Physicians sort of the same thing, which is if you were a good physician and you healed a person, you could be accused of witchcraft and killed. On the other hand, if your patient died, then you could be accused of witchcraft and killed. So, thankfully, during this time, although there are exceptions to it, Jews tended to do better in the Arab and the Muslim worlds than they did in the Christian world, which was the world that Maimonides lived in. And so we're going to dive into a little bit of the history of that. By the way, the first page of your packet, can see a little bit of the introduction to Maimonides. And by the way, as I note in the bottom paragraph, or as Kramer notes in the bottom paragraph, over the gallery doors of the U.S. House of Representatives Chamber of Congress are 23 marble relief portraits of famous lawgivers. One of them is Maimonides. Okay. So next page, page 2, you can see a map of modern Spain. And you see a little town circled Cordoba, which is where Maimonides was born. Cordoba is one of Andalusia's 8 provincial capitals and is located in northeast Seville. The city was founded around 169 BCE by the Roman magistrate Claudius Marcellus and quickly became an important port city that was used for shipping wine and olive oil to ancient Rome. And by the way, again, another random aside, a note about ancient wine. So if you read the Mishnah and you're reading about the Passover Seder, does anybody know what it says about the 4 cups of wine? It says he mixes for him 4 cups of wine. And you think, what does that mean? Because wine in those days was wine concentrate that you added water to and then you mixed it. So if you think about how we used to do orange juice, same sort of thing. So I imagine the wine was not nearly as good as our excellent Manischewitz. Maybe. I'll have to think about that. Actually, there's some excellent kosher wines these days, but that's a presentation for another evening. Throughout this period, Cordoba was home to more cultural sites than Rome itself, and it was the capital of Hispania Baetica. Remains of many buildings that were erected can still be seen today, including the stunning remains of the temple built by Claudius Marcellus. The area of Hispania Baetica was conquered by the Muslim world in 711 in the Common Era and was renamed Andalusia. And Cordoba remained the capital and kept growing. After the area was conquered, work immediately began on a mosque that was to become one of the greatest symbols of the Muslim world. So you can see the Great Mosque of Cordoba in your packet. Today, the Great Mosque is one of the largest mosques in the world. During the time of Islamic rule, Cordoba was the largest city and embodied the most sophisticated culture and the most developed bureaucracy in Europe. Always fun to think about bureaucracy in history. When the Umayyad caliphs were disposed from their caliphate in Damascus in 750, they relocated to Cordoba and had an emirate there that they ruled for nearly 300 years. And so what happened is Cordoba became a major city in the Arab world, skipping a little bit, and it reached its peak in the 10th century. And the Caliphate of Cordoba was, in the 10th century, was the largest and most culturally sophisticated polity in all of Europe. So we think about Rome, but believe it or not, in the 10th century, it wasn't about Rome, it was about Cordoba. During this time, Cordoba housed almost 1,000 mosques, 600 public baths, and it even had street lighting 700 years before before London. Intellectuals, scholars, and doctors were all drawn to the city because of its advancement. And it's important to note this because Maimonides was a product of this intellectual environment of mutual exchange and scholarship. This was a time, and just important to note, of great intellectual and scholarship cultural exchange. Oftentimes when we think about Islamic countries today, and not all of them are the same, don't want to paint them all with a broad brush, but back then it was really diverse and really intellectually curious and places of incredible diversity and creativity. And so even though Jews were considered what we would call second-class citizens, they were still a vital part of the intellectual, economic parts of the community. All of that really came to an end in 1236 as part of the Reconquista with the arrival of Christian forces. And what happened is King Charles V was so impressed by this great mosque. What did he do? He had a cathedral built within its grounds. And so now, as a World Heritage Site, if you go to the Great Mosque, you will see the mosque there, and you will see a cathedral there. So in some ways, it's a little similar if you travel to Israel and you see sites which have mosques in synagogues, in churches, all because how do you elevate your tradition? Well, you put it on top or adjacent to the previous standing tradition. The Jews of Cordoba had been living there since Roman times. Many of them immigrated after the Roman conquest of Israel in the year beginning in 66, in the Common Era, and the destruction of the Temple in 70 in the Common Era. They were welcomed in particular in the 8th century by the Muslims because they supported the Muslims in their battle against the Visigoths. As an aside, the Visigoths were one of two main branches of East Germanic tribes, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, and they were the ones who helped to conquer the Roman Empire, if you will, and they emerged as a distinct people in the 4th century. So going back to the Jews. Jews arrived during the Roman period, but they really began to develop after the Visigoth invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. So by the 4th century, the Christian church was well disposed to them, and they were given until about 589, when that changed. When the church said, convert or leave, or be enslaved. Thankfully, Muslims arrived, got rid of the Christians, and they didn't have to leave, which is a little different than the story of 1492 with the end of the Reconquista, where Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Thankfully, nothing came of that, and the Jews were either had to convert or were kicked out of Spain. By the way, the Inquisition, which nobody ever expects, was originally not about Jews, but about fear of these inauthentic conversions to Christianity. Only later on did they start to target Jews and then appear in Mel Brooks movies. So the Muslim rulers in 711 were viewed as liberators. They freed Jews from slavery, gave them freedom, gave them the ability to organize communities, enabled them to get involved in local economies. They served as diplomats and as court advisors, and they were allowed to contribute in medicine, philosophy, literature, and other disciplines, which led to the rise of great centers of Jewish learning. And there was also a Jewish quarter established in Cordoba, which was near the Great Mosque and the Royal Palace. And one of the reasons for the early Jewish quarters, and later on the early ghettos, was actually to protect the Jews from mobs. They weren't originally as a way of sort of containing them, although they ultimately became that. And so through this arrangement became a bond of mutual dependency between Jews and the ruling establishment. But there was also local resentment as well. So it was an imperfect world. I don't want to paint a rosy picture that life was great for Jews in the Islamic world and terrible in the Christian world. It was better in the Islamic world, but not always great. Questions? Now we're flying through a lot of stuff here. This period is referred to as the convivencia, which loosely translates to coexistence, which you can read about a little bit more in your packets from, turning to the next page, from Constantine's Sword. I'm not going to read through that, but you can certainly read through it at your own leisure. So what happened is Jews became educated in the region. Many were at least bilingual, if not trilingual. So they were speaking Arabic, they were speaking an early version of Spanish, and they were probably also speaking, not Hebrew, Ladino. They were studying Hebrew. Hebrew was not a spoken language, but they were speaking Ladino, which is a sort of combination, if you will, of Hebrew. Speak Arabic, Spanish, and Ladino. They can serve in a way as early Google translators. It was also an age of splendor. We call this era the Golden Age of Spain. I think that sort of overstates what it was like, but if you look throughout the history of Judaism, and especially in Europe, it was much more golden age than anything they experienced everywhere else. Jews studied Greco-Arabic philosophy, they studied Arabic literature and poetry, which is why, by the way, a number of our PU team, a number of our poems that we incorporate into our worship service are based in a lot of ways off of Arabic poetry, especially those later on in the Kabbalistic tradition, like Lecha Dodi. That is influenced by Arabic poetry. And oftentimes in the Reform world, you're not going to see them as much because the early Reformers took a lot of those out, but if you follow more conservative or traditional Siddur, you will see a lot of them. Jews exercised communal self-control. They administered their own courts. They collected their own taxes. They ran their own welfare and educational systems. And unfortunately, as they were thriving, the Muslims were starting to lose control of Spain to Christians. So it's sort of a good-bad sort of scenario. So the Jews are thriving, but the horizon is not looking very pretty. And so this is sort of the world that Maimonides grew up into, which was the world of the Reconquista. So we'll got another map for you. Skip ahead just a little bit. So if you look a few pages ahead, you can see a little map here. And you can see, and I apologize, it's really meant for those who are colorblind. You can see Portugal, you can see France, the Kingdom of Aragon, Granada, Castile, and the Kingdom of Castile. So notice Cordoba, the Muslim world by the time of Maimonides is really, really starting to shrink down. It was during this time, for example, that we see the rise of Jewish mysticism, by the way, including the Zohar, which was written in the 13th century, is considered the most important work of Jewish mysticism. If you want to learn more about Zohar, we have a regular Zohar class. Temple Israel at 11 o'clock on Thursday mornings, not a plug. And it was written by Moses de Leon, who ascribed it to a much earlier rabbi, Shimon Bar Yochai, but was really written in the 13th century. And it is very possible that Maimonides was influenced by this mystical movement. The Reconquista ended on January 2nd, 1492, with the conquest of Granada. Notice Cordoba. And the last Muslim ruler of Granada, Muhammad XII, better known as Bobadil, surrendered his kingdom to Ferdinand and Isabella, and thus ended Muslim rule of Iberia. The Inquisition came about in 1481, and in 1492, as we know, Jews were driven out of the land of Spain. Those who refused to convert. There were actually Jews on the ships with Columba, including quite probably his principal navigator, Rodriguez. Columbus was not Jewish. There's no historical indication he was Jewish. Some people now like to claim he was Jewish when they didn't before because of all the horrible things he did. That's conversation for another day. Most Jews fled. A lot of them ended up in Italy. Some ended up in places like the Netherlands. Some ended up in the New World, including a small Jewish community in Recife, Brazil. And then they fled the Inquisition. And in the late 1600s, they landed in a place called New Amsterdam. The governor Stuyvesant reached out to the Dutch West India Company and said, I don't want these Jews. The Dutch West India Company, which had several major shareholders who were Jewish, said as long as they don't present a problem, they can stay there. This was in 1654, and that became the first permanent Jewish community in the New World, ultimately becoming New York. Like to note, and I know this is a random aside from Maimonides, but just good historical lesson, the first 5 major congregations founded in North America were all on the coast, and they were all Sephardic. They became Ashkenazic because they were taken over by later waves of Ashkenazic immigration in the late 1800s, but they all started off as Sephardic communities. Okay, back to Maimonides. So, not going to get into all of the history and the rise of the Muslim world, but what happened is his family, there was actually a rise in Muslim fundamentalism, and his family was threatened with the choice of conversion to Islam, death, or exile. It should all sound familiar. This was in 1148, and his family, among others, chose exile. So for the next 10 years, they lived in southern Spain, and they eventually settled in Fez. And there's, I believe, Cantor's going to be going on a trip to Morocco. Anyone's interested in going with her can talk to her. And it was during this time in Fez that he really acquired most of his secular knowledge, and he composed his acclaimed commentary on the Mishnah. So this is 1166 through 1168. So he did that in Fez. So he was influenced by his time in Spain, but his family fled to Fez relatively early on when he was, I don't know, maybe around 10 years old. But here is an interesting question we don't know the answer to, which was how were they able to stay in Spain and ultimately settle in Fez? There is speculation that his family may have theoretically and temporarily converted to Islam in order to live, in order to get out of the situation. So we like to believe that there are really two groups, the ones who converted and the ones who didn't. But in actuality, throughout history, there's been a third group, which is rather than engage in Kiddush Hashem, which sometimes you don't have a choice, where you're sanctified in the name of God, but sometimes you pay lip service so you can get out of the situation. Yeah?
Didn't he move to Egypt, escaping this conversion in Fez?
He did ultimately move to Egypt. He went to Israel a little bit and then settled ultimately in Egypt. So eventually they left Fez because Fez was the heart of this Islamic fundamentalist movement. Why they went there, I think they went there for the hats. But they were only there for a short period of time.
Do they know what caused the uprising of fundamentalism?
Same thing that causes uprises of fundamentalism to this day. It's just part of what happens is you get into a more, and I'm using inappropriate terms for it, not historical. You get into a more progressive community, and then it becomes more accepting, and more people are welcome and embraced. And then you will have fundamentalists who reject and have a huge backlash, and then there will be a popular uprising to try and quell sort of this more progressive, welcoming, thinking community, which has happened throughout history. Thankfully, that no longer occurs. So, after living in southern Spain, he lived briefly in Palestine. As a reminder, Israel was renamed Palestine by the Romans after another uprising in the 100s in the Common Era. They conquered it again, and they renamed it as a way of humiliating Jews. So that's why it no longer had the name of Israel. So he settled there for a little bit before ultimately residing in Fostat, Egypt, where he was a physician of the Grand Vizier and Sultan of Egypt. And he even, and here's a little historical anomaly, treated Richard the Lionheart while he was on the Crusades. Maimonides was considered to be one of the great physicians of his time and being influenced by renowned Islamic thinkers such as Ibn Rushd and Al-Ghazali. It was during this time that he composed most of his well-known works, including the Mishnah Torah. Maimonides died in Fostat in 1204, and then they took his body back to Tiberia, to Tiberias, which is back now in Israel, where he was buried. His son Avraham was recognized as a great scholar, succeeded Maimonides as Nagid, head of the Egyptian Jewish community. He took up his father's role as court physician at the age of 18, and he honored the memory of his father throughout his career and defended his father's writings. And the office of Nagid, the head of the Jewish community of Egypt, was held by his family for 4 generations until the end of the 14th century. So who was he as Nagid? For Jewish communities, they could not govern themselves without the benefit of halakhic rulings. What that means is, and we like to think of all Jewish communities as being what we would say orthodox. And then when we think orthodox, we think of, the Haredi with the black hats and the long black coats and long beards and the payas. The truth is, Jews lived according to their communal customs. They lived and they dressed and they sort of were part of their local communities. By the way the Haredi dress today is modeled after Polish nobility from the 1700s. Jews haven't always looked that way, and Jews in the Middle East tended to dress like Arabs in the Middle East. Why? Because it's hot. You're not wearing these heavy woolen clothes in 120-degree summer. And when I would walk around Tucson and see the occasional Haredi Jew, I would think, what are you doing? Dressed like our traditional Jews from the Middle East. So what happened for all these communities is you wanted to live according to Jewish tradition, but inevitably questions would arise. And so rabbis or leaders of the community would write a question, and then they would send it along with a little payment, because that's how a lot of these rabbis paid themselves, to answer the halachic question. And then they would scour literature and then send back answers known as responsa. So this tradition of responsa was how you would find out what you were supposed to do in your local community. And so Maimonides served as the authority for the Egyptian Jewish community when they had halachic questions. So he had many kippahs on his head, if you will. By the way, there's never been, just as a reminder, there's never been one head of the Jewish community. We don't have a pope. Even though he wears a kippah, don't be fooled. But we have had heads of communities. So there are, in Israel, there's a chief Sephardic rabbi, chief Ashkenazic rabbi, there's a chief rabbi of England, so on and so forth. And really, their role is to help answer halakhic questions. So Maimonides was the one doing that for the community of Egypt. He also came from, in his commentary in the Mishnah, he lists that going back 7 generations, his family was involved in trading, and he took his medical career very seriously, and he wrote extensively on drugs, diet, and treatment. He lectured on physiology and therapeutics. So he was a man of many interests and a lot of knowledge. And it's really interesting. I have this wonderful memory. So when I was in rabbinic school, we took a course on, some of my classmates and I took a course on Jewish medical ethics. So in order to study Jewish medical ethics, you got to go back to not just the Talmud, but the Middle Ages and read a lot of those writings. So we read a lot of Maimonides. Now, for those of you who may not know, my wife, she's the daughter of Israelis and she's fluent in Hebrew. At the time, she was in residency. So she'd be working, this was before they changed the rules, she'd be doing 48-hour shifts. She'd come home exhausted. We'd have the chavruta in our kitchen, in our dining room, and we'd say, before you can go shower and change and go to bed, we need you to help us translate this. So my poor wife, on no sleep, is translating a a text from the Middle Ages on medicine, having just come from her residency. And inevitably be like, what? But some of it they were not so wrong on. Questions? There are times where she's like, I should have signed your smicha. I'm like, you're not wrong. My ordination certificate. Okay, so Maimonides, some of his early writings, you can see it here where it says early studies. He wrote in his late teens or early 20s a book on logic called The Art of Logic. He either wrote it while he was living either in Andalusia or when he moved to to Fez. And logic was a central concern of his while he was studying medicine, because he believed in scientific method and proper reasoning, as well as the study of Aristotle, to be central to his intellectual pursuits. So as a reminder, the writings of Aristotle have been lost during the Dark Ages, rediscovered in the Muslim world, and then Maimonides is studying it, and then he writes a treatise on logic, just to give you a little insight into his brilliance. As Kramer wrote, may be said his only purely philosophic work with no hint of theology or anything of specifically Jewish content. He doesn't cite the Bible or the Talmud, and instead he's working through mathematics and physics. So think about that. How many rabbis do you know who are experts in mathematics? If ever you want to be entertained, and I highly recommend this, watch a group of rabbis try to figure out how to break down a check. Now, the treatise consists of 14 chapters, and you can research it in your own time if you wish. He also wrote a book called The Revision of Perfection, and it was a comprehensive work on geometry and optics, which was written by Yusuf ibn Ahmad I in the 11th century, because it really related to astronomy. It was later translated into Latin, and Maimonides, his work was not necessarily original, but he used it as a manual for instruction, often reorganizing its materials and simplifying it for later students, which would then become how he approached the writing of the Mishnah Torah. And he was responsible for introducing the perfection, a work on astronomy and optics, to Egypt. So that demonstrates how he's translating knowledge from the Greco-Roman world to the Spanish world, to the Arab world, and further brings it into the Christian and the Arab world. And you can see a little bit about that, called Treatise on the Art of Logic. He also wrote, because he was a man of many interests, a treatise on the calendar. He was very interested in intercalculation, including the seasons, holidays, and new months, and he wrote it to be in an accessible style, to be a practical handbook on the calendar. Why is that important? Well, if anybody has ever read the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, and tried to figure out the Hebrew calendar, there's no way to do it. Everything that's based on our Hebrew calendar comes to us from rabbinic interpretive tradition. I tell people, never take anything I say as a matter of faith except the Hebrew calendar. Just buy one, get an app. Don't even worry about it because it's so immensely complicated. As an aside, as you guys know, I like asides. The way it works is there are certain days holidays cannot fall. So for example, Yom Kippur cannot start on a Thursday evening. Why? Shabbat. You'll never be able to prepare for Shabbat, which means there are certain days Rosh Hashanah cannot fall. And to make it more complicated, we have a lunar calendar tied to the solar calendar, because Sukkot has to be in the fall, Passover is spring, Shavuot has to be in the summer, unlike the Muslim calendar, which is purely lunar, which is why Ramadan, which just started, I think like last night, happens to bounce around the year. So you have to readjust. So he wrote a treatise on the Hebrew calendar to help us make sense of it. And by the way, the calendar is still good for another 300-400 years before we have to figure it out again. He wrote commentary on the Babylonian Talmud, but he did not write a complete one. He wrote it before the age of 23, in case you think you've wasted your opportunities. The commentary covers approximately 2/3 of the Talmud, but unfortunately, most of the surviving work is fragmentary, and we don't have a lot of it. But as a man of diverse interests, he got distracted by other topics and never really completed it. He also wrote a little bit about the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud. And he referenced it as well and would oftentimes use it as a guide for his later work. So really, Maimonides is doing any number of things. And then ultimately, as we talked about, which was the Mishnah Torah. So in a moment, I'm going to open up to any final questions because I see we're rapidly running out of time and I'm running out of voice. Maimonides was a product of his time, which meant he was exposed to a lot of intellectual endeavors that many others would not have been exposed to even a generation later. Yet, his brilliance enabled him to be able to coalesce all of those different intellectual movements, from philosophy and mathematics to optics, to science, to medicine, and to Jewish law. And it's because of his intellectual curiosity that ultimately profoundly shaped Judaism ever since. And then this point, I think, is perhaps one of the most important points to take home. He did not live just in the Jewish world. Matter of fact, if he looked, I would argue, at the way some Jewish communities live today, he would be very heartbroken. Because Judaism was not supposed to be lived in isolation. It was supposed to be lived in relationship to the Christian world, the Muslim world, but mostly to the world of intellectual curiosity. And it's because of his curiosity that he shaped the approach to Jewish law, which ironically became a closed corpus and became a way of insulating the Jewish world from the larger world, which I would argue was never his intent. So if we're going to take home a lesson today, and by the way, this is just a quick run through of his life, there's so much more to it. Be curious. If you find yourself inspired by a certain topic, explore it, learn it, dive into it, get messy with it. Because he was a curious man of diverse interests. And those diverse interests helped elevate all of his interests and passions. And so I hope today's presentation of Maimonides inspires you to keep being curious and to learn more, because, and I'm going to get on my soapbox for a moment. Unfortunately, we live in a world right now of dichotomy, which is I'm right, you're wrong, or yes or no, black or white. That's not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is to say yes, but, or no, and. The Jewish way is to learn, to ask questions, to expand our knowledge, to expand Torah, which is Maimonides was what he was all about. So rather than be certain, rather than be sure, let's be a little bit more like Maimonides and be curious. Thank you, everyone.